Communication, Clause 7.4 of ISO 14001:2015. Hello friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. Coverage in the standard. In this chapter, we would explain you the Clause 7.4 of the ISO 14001:2015. This Clause 7.4 is divided into three subclauses as follows. First, Subclause 7.4.1. It addresses the general requirements of communication regarding establishment, implementation, and maintenance of communication process of the organization. Second, Subclause 7.4.2. It addresses the internal communication process within the organization at every level as required. Third, Subclause 7.4.2. It addresses the communication process with external parties as part of the compliance obligations and organization policy. Reference clause within standards or the other standards which can be useful for this chapter. To understand the clause 7.4 with their subclauses 7.4.1, 7.4.2 and 7.4.3, you need to refer the clause 3 of this standard, that is ISO 14001:2015. You may also refer the clause 5.2 of the EMS policy. These are the useful reference to understand the requirements of this clause. Under external references, you may refer Environmental Family Standards, that is ISO 14004:2016, ISO 14005:2019, ISO 19011:2018, and ISO 17021-1 can be useful material to understand this chapter. Now, let's understand the benefits of learning this clause. At the end of this chapter, you will gain the necessary knowledge and skills, and you will be able to verify the organization's communication process relevant to environmental management system. Clause 7.4 explains the establishments, implementation, and maintaining the process of communication within the organization. It also covers the external and internal communication regarding the EMS policy. In short, you will learn. First, Subclause 7.4.1. Under this, the organization shall prescribe the process of communication required for external and internal parties. The process shall define minimum 4 points. First point, what will be communicated? Point 2, when will be communicated? Point 3, how it will be communicated? Point 4, with whom it will be communicated. Further, this subclause also addresses that the compliance obligations shall be taken into consideration and information communicated on EMS must be reliable. Internal communication subclause 7.4.2. This subclause covers the internal communication process, that is, which is done at various levels of the staffs. In other terms, we can explain it that environmental management system shall be communicated at various levels and functions of the organization along with any changes in the same. It will also be ensured that process as designed under this subclause shall enable the employees to contribute in continual improvement. Subclause 7.4.2. This subclause covers the external communication process and it's required that the relevant information related to environmental management system as part of compliance obligations shall be communicated to all external persons. The changes in organization EMS shall also be communicated to all external persons. Let's have a brief introduction of the ISO 14001:2015, Clause 7.4. Clause 7.4 addresses on organization communication process. This clause is further divided into three subclauses as follows. First, Clause 7.4.1, General. Second, Clause 7.4.2, Internal communication. Third, Clause 7.4.3, External communication. Now, let's explain you the Clause 7.4.1, which addresses all types of communications, including external and internal to the organization. This clause requires that an organization must establish, implement, and maintain a process for communications within the organization and with the external parties. The organization shall also take into account the legal and other requirements and shall ensure that the information communicated must be consistent with EMS policy and is reliable. The communication process shall define that. First, what information to be communicated? Let's explain this through an example. The environmental policy shall be communicated. Environmental policy is the relevant topic for communication. Point 2. When it shall be communicated, that is, at appropriate time. The EMS policy information shall be communicated once it is approved, otherwise, desired results could not be achieved. Point 3. With whom to communicate? For example, under internal communication, it shall be with employees at all levels within the organization, and externally, it will be with contractors, visitors, or any interested party. The organization shall keep record evidence of the communications made with all relevant persons. Now, let's understand the subclause 7.4.2, which talks about the internal communication. It is very important to communicate effectively the environmental management system at various levels and department of the organization. This communication shall include the changes made from time to time at all levels of the staff within the organization. Let's understand what can be defined as internal communication through following examples. First, environmental objectives with its target within the organization staff. Second, creating awareness on environmental changes amongst the staff. Third, communication of EMS policy among the employees of the organization. Fourth, intimation of accidents on environmental issues to management. Now, let's explain the clause 7.4.3, external communication. Under this, the organization shall define a process of communication on its environmental policy with external parties like contractors, vendors, media, stakeholders, government and government authorities, etc. The process shall be clear and prompt, so in case of any happening, the communication can be done appropriately. Let's understand the external communication with the following example. Point 1. Complaints on environmental issues to government authorities. Point 2. Communication of EMS policy with certification bodies for ISO 14001-2015 certificate. Point 3. Communication to media and various stakeholders of the company on establishment of latest environmental technologies which reduces the air pollutions. These are few examples of external communication which dealt with organizations' defined process, requirement of the clause of the standard. Now, let's have a plain reading of the clause 7.4 and their subclauses 7.4.1, 7.4.2 and 7.4.3 of the ISO 14001-2015. Clause 7.4 Communication. Subclause 7.4.1 General. The organization shall establish, implement, and maintain the processes needed for internal and external communications relevant to the environmental management system, including first, on what it will communicate. Second, when to communicate. Third, with whom to communicate. Fourth, how to communicate. When establishing its communication processes, the organization shall, point 1, take into account its compliance obligations. Point 2, ensure that environmental information communicated is consistent with information generated within the environmental management system and is reliable. The organization shall respond to relevant communications on its environmental management system. The organization shall retain documented information as evidence of the communications as appropriate. Subclause 7.4.2 Internal communication. The organization shall, point 1, internally communicate information relevant to the environmental management system among the various levels and functions of the organization, including changes to the environmental management system as appropriate. Point 2. Ensure its communication processes enables person doing work under the organization's control to contribute to continual improvement. Subclause 7.4.3 External communication. The organization shall externally communicate information relevant to the environmental management system as established by the organization's communication processes and as required by its compliance obligations. Mandatory documents and retention of documents. Let us understand the mandatory documents and records required to maintain under clause 7.4. There is no mandatory document, but mandatory record on communication are required to be maintained, named as below. First, evidence of communication, clause 7.4. Further, you can also maintain documents on communication process as mentioned below. However, it is optional on the part of the organization to maintain or not. First, procedure for communication, clause 7.4. Some additional factor. Under this section, we would explain you the whole requirement in a single section. The clause 7.4 talks about the communication. The requirements are explained under subclause 7.4.1, subclause 7.4.2 and subclause 7.4.3. As above explained, the organization shall define a written process of communication with internal parties and external parties which are relevant persons to know the organization environmental policy. Next, EMS policy shall be communicated amongst the employees as well as its vendor, contractors, and authorities. It shall be ensured that the communication process is effective and implemented as desired. Practice writing non-conformity under this clause 7.4. Now, let us understand how to write a non-conformity. It can be understood through an example of NC as given in AFAR, Audit Findings Action Report 1. Last but not least, now let us understand the common mistakes which auditors do while performing audit under this clause 8.1 and clause 8.2. Point 1. Auditors ask irrelevant questions for the organization which does not relate with the organization to be audited. Point 2. Sometimes auditors start thinking for the option while auditors need to understand the client process and to decide if the client can achieve the result of the MSS through their own process. Point 3. Auditors start consulting activities. Point 4. Auditors start expecting document and records in clause where this may not be mandatory requirement. Point 5. Auditors miss to verify the education record. Point 6. Auditors miss to identify the EMS policy awareness to lower level of staff than higher level. Dear friends, we have now come to the conclusion of this training session. See you soon with an exciting new topic. Till then, goodbye.